Welcome my friend and teacher, Rabbi Martin Cohen. And I particularly emphasize teacher in welcoming Rabbi Cohen in our midst, in that I have relied throughout my preparation of Psalms these last 15 plus months on Rabbi Cohen's writing, a book he wrote called Our Haven and Our Strength, that I have referred to this morning in the teaching of Psalm 147. And what's distinctive, Martin, about your analysis of Psalms is several things. First, Rabbi Cohen's translations are creatively accessible. So he tries to convey the flow of the Hebrew in a way that would resonate with a contemporary English reader. And in that sense, he's not as tied to the literal Hebrew as I am in my own translations. Secondly, what I have delighted in is Rabbi Cohen's imagining the prompt of the psalm. So this morning, for instance, in Psalm 147, Rabbi Cohen speculates that the description of hail and ice was a Levite who might have encountered such a cold night in Jerusalem where snow comes. And trying to find the prompt for the psalmist will be one of the things I look to learn from with Rabbi Cohen in terms of his understanding of how Psalms came about. And third, what I valued in Rabbi Cohen's presentation is, as a pulpit rabbi, Rabbi Cohen always asks the question, how is this relevant to the reader? And often leaves the reader with a question, linking, in many cases, the prompt or the theme of the psalmist to how that would play out in our own lives. And so, Martin, you have been a companion, and in teaching Psalms since March 2020, have really fallen in love with Psalms to appreciate their variety and their depth. How did you come to fall in love with Psalms?
Well, there are lots of different ways to answer that question. First, I'm a musician my whole life, so I'm a pianist, I'm a flute player, I'm a singer. I'm actually married to a high school music teacher. So music is a big part of our life, and so I suppose because another big part of my life is my love of scripture and my love of Tanakh. I was naturally drawn to the one book in the Tanakh that purports to be a book of music. There's no question really that almost all the superscriptions in the Psalms, the ones that are obscure, that refer to musical instruments or refer to melodies that the author assumes the audience is going to know, or different types of rhythm or genre, that these are meant to be these are not meant to be obscure. They're only obscure to us in the 21st century. In their day, they were meant to be well known. The authors apparently expected everyone to know what it was. If I were to write a song today and I was to say, sing this to the melody of My Country 'Tis of Thee or My Darling Clementine, being an American of the 21st century, I wouldn't feel the need to explain further. I would expect that everyone knows the melody to My Darling Clementine. Everyone sort of knows that. And these authors also imagine that. We call it sometimes the fund of presumed knowledge, what an author simply doesn't bother explaining because he or she expects the audience to know what that is. We do that all the time, naturally, in our own discourse. We make reference to things that we sort of now, because we're all part of the same American culture, we sort of know what you can expect everyone to know about. If I mentioned the Yankees, I wouldn't bother to tell you they were a baseball team, but maybe if more obscure sports teams, I would have to tell you what game they play or what city they're in. Same idea. So I was drawn to this because it's clearly a book of music. But when you look more closely, when I looked more closely, I found that I couldn't quite say clearly to myself what this book was, what this genre was. Is you see everywhere in a million different handbooks that that this is the hymnal of the Second Temple. I can't tell you how many different times I've seen those words in print. This is the Second Temple songbook. This is the Levites hymnal. This is a you know, some sort of shiron that was used in the Second Temple, like, you know, like every synagogue has a book of songs that people sing after dinner on Friday night, and or in different settings, or summer camps have shironim that bring together all the words. I might add also, assuming that the children know the melodies, right? Those shironim rarely have music in them. They just have the words. They expect you to know the tunes. The Psalms are the same. They have the words. They expect you to know the melodies. But as a, you're supposed to turn your phone off before you, let me just turn this off. Okay. Drawn to this music, it's hard to say what the genre is. If these are, if everyone is right that this is the hymnal of the Second Temple, what does that mean exactly? Did the Levites sing these songs? If you've been through the Psalms up through 147, you know that there are some Psalms that it's sort of unimaginable that they sang, you know, as part of the worship service. Did they sing the 88th Psalm as part of the worship service, or the 22nd, or the 107th? These Psalms that are long, complicated, obscure, or relentlessly depressing, and about the misery of the poet and his oppression, sense of being oppressed, and the danger that he lives in, fear of violence, fear of attack, fear of being maligned. It's just hard to imagine that the people sat down after in the Mikdash after the evening sacrifice was cleared away, the afternoon sacrifice was cleared away, to sing these songs around the campfire. It just doesn't seem possible. But that leads to the big question. If this is not a hymnal of the Beit HaMikdash, in the sense that the Ramah Shiron is the songbook of Camp Ramah, then what actually is it? Is it an anthology? An anthology of what? Is it a songbook? Were there melodies to all the songs? How come only some of them have sing along to the melody of superscriptions? What about the other ones? Were they poems that are meant to be read? In what context? In school? And were they declaimed by poets? Were they? The more I worked on it, the less clear it was to me what this whole thing was. And that was the beginning point, Ellie. That was, may I call you Ellie in front of your congregants?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And
That-
where did that lead you? So now that you shared your uncertainty about where the Psalms came from and how they were used, what did you then learn and understand?
Well, I had those questions floating around when I started to work seriously on the text of Psalms. And the first thing that I found that I didn't expect, and I should tell you that I'm not speaking as someone who was unfamiliar with the book. I've studied Tanakh my whole adult life. I started at JTS when I was 21 years old. Before that, I had a university degree in Hebrew. I spent a lot of time with this book, but when I started really reading it carefully, looking at it not just in a cursory way, or not just in a you know, sort of in a casual way, the first thing that struck me, Ellie, that I realized that I had no way to explain, was my sense that this not my sense, but my realization that the Psalms are studded with oracles, that over and over and over these poets report words that God spoke to them in the style of prophets. That's what prophets do. They feel God's communicative presence in some palpable way. And then if they are skilled, if they're articulate and eloquent, they can funnel that experience through the prism of human language to speak out in public and say, and create a literary frame to express what they experienced of God's presence. That's what prophecy is. But the psalmists aren't supposed to be prophets. Didn't I just say a minute ago this was the Levite songbook? If this is the Levite songbook, so where do these, and there are lots of them, where do these oracles come from? Were they ancient oracles? Then why aren't any of the books of why don't they appear in any of the books of the prophets? Were they secrets? If they were secrets, why are they in the Psalms? And of course, then the question is, when actually did the Psalms get written? It's if you look at the book of Psalms as you have so carefully over this last year and a half, you know that that anyone can see that that the book has a complicated editorial history. Two Psalms are identical, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. Clearly, if even an untalented editor wouldn't put the same poem in the anthology twice, there's a history here. There was smaller groups of things that were put together, and in fact, the Psalms is divided into 5 parts. But it doesn't seem likely that each of those parts was once a book and then someone just pasted them together like to create a bigger book. It seems more complicated than that. And also, as you know, I'm sure you noticed, there are fragments of Psalms that appear in other Psalms. There seems to be a lot of history here. So if that's the case, then where did these oracles come from? If they're not ancient, were they Second Temple oracles? But I thought there were no more prophets. At least there aren't. We don't know of any prophets. The Bible ends with the rabbis believe that the prophets who accompanied the Jews back from Babylon at the end of the 6th century BCE, Zechariah, Malachi, and Haggai, were Sof Nuvuah, the end of prophecy. But if they were the last prophets, then who are these people? And where did these prophecies come from? And are they bona fide prophecies? If they are, then what's their history? And if they're not, then why are they in the Bible? These are the questions that plague me, Eli. These are the questions that I realized I had no idea how to begin to answer.
So what I hear you sharing is the question that first emerged, which was why these poems, and that led to seeing these poems in significant part as having a prophetic dimension. And where does that lead you?
Well, I'll tell you, I can answer the question because I know the answer to that question, but it was a long journey, and it began in a certain sense. I don't know if you've exposed your students to Midrash Tahilim. The rabbis had you all know the word Midrash, I'm sure. Midrash is rabbinic interpretation, and there are collections of Midrash, and some of them are very old, some of them are less old, some of them are not that old at all. But Midrash Tahilim, the collection of rabbinic remarks about the Psalms, seems to be about a middling antiquities, from the late, probably from the late Talmudic period. Not entirely clear. The latest authorities mentioned are Talmudic rabbis, but the book itself is not referenced in the Talmud, so probably towards the end of there. And
meaning like 6th to 9th century.
Something like that. And Midrash Tahilim opens up with this long exposition, which I had seen before, but I never really thought about carefully, that describes the Psalms as the parallel work to the Torah itself. And they explain in detail what they mean. There are 5 books of the Torah. There are 5 books of the Psalms. The Psalms, the Torah is presented as the revelation of a prophet, of Moses. But the Midrash points out that the Bible, particularly the book of Chronicles, which is a Second Temple work, describes David as a prophet as well. So there was a certain parallel there, and I ran with that thought. By the way, I won't take the time now to quote them, but there must be 24 or more different ways that Midrash Tahilim makes the works parallel. But the thing that struck me as the most profound is this notion which opened up my eyes really to my whole approach to this, that the Psalms is a work of prophecy, that the words that are presented as divine oracles are prophetic statements, but that the rest of it is also the work of prophecy, not unlike the way we take the Torah to be a work of the entire Torah to be a work of prophecy, even though there are passages that are not presented in the text as divine revelation. In other words, the Torah does have passages like that. You all know there are millions of them. Hashem spoke to Moses at the tent of the door meeting, at the door to the tent of meeting, and said these words. And then what follows is the oracle, the revelation. That phrase appears 12 times in the Torah, or the Sinai narrative itself, where God is depicted as speaking to the nation. But later on, it became more regular to think of the Torah itself as a prophetic work. And in fact, the Torah itself sees itself that way, because at the end of the Torah, we have this narrative that depicts Moses, the greatest of all prophets, as sewing it all together, taking all the written documents that he had prepared, which the Torah references earlier, taking all the oracles, which he had apparently jotted down on scrolls, and sewing the whole thing, prefacing the whole thing with a version of the history of the Israelite saga, of the history of the world and the Israelite people, and then sort of sewing this all together into one big document, which he called, the name isn't given in scripture, but which we call the Torah, which the Bible elsewhere calls Torah Moshe, Torah Elohim, Torah of God, the Torah of Moses, or just the Torah. So my understanding was that the Psalms, that ultimately the Psalms really is that this is not just a midrashic flourish, but this is really an historic reality. That the same way that the Torah itself reflects ultimately the priestly orientation to divine worship and the mission of the Jewish people, the Psalms, which everybody says were created by the Levites, is the alternative version of the Torah of Israel. It's the Torah HaLeviim. When I started to look more carefully, I realized that there are lots of these parallels. There's a famous passage in the Book of Kings describing the Reformation that took place in the reign of King Hezekiah, King Hizkiyahu, where the Bible refers to this great procession of, it says, Kohanim Unevi'im, that there were priests and prophets led the procession. Well, when the chronicler retells that story, he tells it almost verbatim, but he changes the word Nevi'im to Levi'im. So it says that the priests and the Levites led it. To him, apparently, the Levites were, by the way, there's a certain assonance between Levi'im and Nevi'im, which I think is probably not accidental. To understand that in the terms of the Second Temple period, there was this huge rift between the Kohanim, whose Torah was the Torah of Moses, and the Levites, whose Torah was what we call the Book of Psalms. And that would also explain the other theme of the Psalms, which is this incredible fear of the enemy. The psalmists are terrified. They're afraid of being ambushed, of being kidnapped. Some of them write about their fear of being murdered, they're treated with disrespect. They're spit upon. They're laughed at. Their clothing is torn when they walk in the street to humiliate them. The psalmists are not happy people. You just spent a year reading their poetry. You know how miserable these people are and how afraid they are. So that's another question that struck me. What are they so afraid of? Was ancient Jerusalem such a lawless place of civic mayhem that normal citizens were terrified to walk down the street for fear of being kidnapped? Or was there something else here? Were they afraid of was there a huge rift between different spiritual groups and that was built around their alleged co-host role in the temple? But maybe they didn't see it quite that way. After all, the counterpart to with this, I'll finish what I'm saying, and then I won't just keep talking. The counterpart to the oracles in the Book of Psalms are the many passages that appear to reference, although always obscurely, prayer or physical rituals that are meant to awaken the prophetic spirit. How many times did you read in the Psalms, answer us, O Lord, you who are throned on high, speak to us, show us the light of your face, illuminate your face, show us your face. Over and over, the references to seeing God's face, to seeing the light of God's face, to hearing God's voice, to hearing God respond to them. Those passages are the counterpart to the actual oracles. So the more you read about it, the more prophetic this book sounds. And yet there are not supposed to be any prophets in the Second Temple period. That's supposed to be a feature of First Temple Judaism. It seems to me that that's not correct. And that the Psalms itself, which is clearly a Second Temple work, because at least in its final version, it has to be, because it makes reference to events that post-dated the First Temple period, for instance, the exile in Babylon. And it seems to me that that there was a clear effort among certain schools of Jewish people in ancient times to awaken the prophetic spirit. Yes, Ellie.
So
That's an awfully long. It's an awfully long answer to what was basically a simple question,
but it's long because in some ways it's a reorientation as to the nature of Psalms, and I haven't seen it written elsewhere. In that sense, it's clearly something that emerged for you and has found importance in understanding what is distinctive about this book. So I'm going to just reframe. The book in Midrash Tahilim is described in parallel to the 5 books of Moses, and so much of the tone of the Psalms are both calling on God to speak, often presenting what they have heard from God, and from what you're also sharing, the persecution. Is it right? Is the persecution of the prophet?
Well, we do know that the prophets were. Maybe I should pause for a minute, Ellie, and remind everybody that in earlier times, First Temple times, there were 2 different types of prophets. There were the famous ones that everyone's heard of, Isaiah, Micah, people like that, Amos, Hosea. But there were also the prophetic caste, the caste with an E at the end, the B'nai Nevi'im, that are referenced throughout the Book of Kings, that seemed to have been a type of prophetic caste that cultivated this prophetic experience of God's communicative presence. And they were not famous people. They were not. They didn't leave behind literary works like Isaiah or Amos. They were sort of working prophets. We don't know that much about them. Eliyahu seems to be part of that group, or Elisha. And of course, the other ones that were unnamed. When the Bible talks about the kings of Israel at odds with their prophets, or else the king seeking the prophetic, going to ask the prophets whether they should go to battle or not, there seem to be hundreds of these prophets floating around. They seem to have been a whole. I'm not sure what the right word is, a caste, or maybe a guild, or it's hard to exactly say what the right word in English would be, but they seem to have been a group of people who cultivated prophecy. And if you read those stories, the way they cultivated it is remarkable. The literary prophets often have the same trope. If you were in shul last week, for instance, and listening to the Haftarah, you heard Jeremiah describe his calling as an accident. He was cooking lunch one day when suddenly the word of God came to him and said, did anyone read the Haftarah in shul on Saturday? They said, he said, what are you doing? He said, I'm making soup. He says, oh yeah, what is well, first he says, I'm making a pot of soup. He says, look, it's boiling over. He says, which way is it boiling over? And he says, I don't know, it's boiling to the north. He says, God says, that's because the disaster is coming from the north. And then he says, and look over there, what do you see there? Jeremiah says, I see an almond tree. So this is a pun you have to know Hebrew to get. He says, shkediyah, almond in Hebrew is an almond tree is a shkediyah. And shaked means I am diligent. So God says, you see that shkediyah? That's because I am shaked. I'm being diligent to bring destruction to the people. But you get the sense that Jeremiah was nobody. He was some guy. He was making lunch when God came to him. Amos has the same trope, that he was walking around in a sycamore grove when God suddenly came to him. And you get the sense from all the prophets, even Isaiah in the famous, in the holy chapter 6, where he describes his investiture. You get the sense he just came out of the blue. But these other B'nai Nevi'im, they were working prophets. They were not. They were, they were not people to whom this just happened. They knew how to awaken the prophetic spirit. They used body contortions. They probably used hallucinogenic drugs, probably mushrooms, maybe. They tried to hypnotize themselves with these long, repetitive hymns. There's a famous story in the book of Samuel where the prophet Saul, who is they come across Saul naked, rolling around in the mud, and they say, "What is this?" And the response is, "Look at that, the king of Israel rolling around naked in the mud. I didn't know Saul was a prophet." Apparently, in ancient times, when you saw a guy rolling around naked in the mud, you didn't think this is a crazy person rolling around naked in the mud. You say, "Oh, this must be a prophet trying to awaken the prophetic spirit." I don't know if they all did this, but some of them did. That line is not meant as a joke in the Bible. It's meant as a rational comment.
So
So
how did it go from this array of prophetic writings, poem-like, because they're highly structured, to
yes.
being, how do you see it? One first being used. Once there was a prophecy, how did that become used and useful?
You mean, are you asking how they awakened this prophetic spirit,
No,
or what they
no,
did with it
what
afterwards?
they did with it. What they did with it once it was written down.
So that's the question. Well, the real answer is that no one knows, because there is no narrator's book describing the creation of the Psalms. Although, never being one to fail to self-promote, I have a novel coming out in November, which features which is about the creation of the Book of Psalms, set in Old Jerusalem, and by the way, which tells the story of the Psalm you learned this morning, the 147th Psalm, because the whole mystery ends in that snowstorm.
Mm. Mm.
So there will be eventually a book to read. But uh, I guess ultimately the ultimate concept of Israelite culture was was to submit to the will of God and to serve God. And the question is how. So the Torah answer is that God reveals these commandments, and you show your fealty to the divine by obediently obeying them. And in some senses, you get the sense the more obscure the better. If you not eat poison doesn't show much fealty to God. What kind of a crazy person would eat poison? But to not eat pork, when pork is not a bad thing, lots of people eat pork, they don't get sick or die. It's a tasty meat. To turn away from it merely because God has commanded you to, that shows your devotion to the law. That shows your respect for the covenant. That's the Torah idea. But the Psalms idea seems to be that the way you establish a relationship of fealty and communion with God is not by obeying these rules, although maybe they also obeyed them, but by actually seeking a personal, idiosyncratic, private level of communion with God that is more akin to the type of intense relationship that intimate friends have, where they deeply listen to each other, where they spend time in each other's company, when they sense each other's presence even when they can't quite see them, when they feel bound to. I hope you all have friends like this. I'm lucky enough to. When you feel bound to another soul in a way that is not quite romantic and not specifically sexual, but just it's intensely intimate. You feel that you feel that someone else is the Hebrew expression is that your soul is bound up with this person's. That's what true friendship is. Uh, the And that seems to be the great goal of the psalmists, to establish this type of intimate connection with God that makes it possible to actually feel that God speaks through you. What a lot of the oracles are obscure. That's obvious. I don't know what Moab is my washing pot is supposed to mean. Although that's also my novel, by the way. The
What's the name of the novel?
It's called Jerusalem Ghosts, and it's coming out I hope in November, by Whip and Stock Publisher in Portland, Oregon. And I will, Ellie, I'll make sure that I send you a link to it, and you can
Yeah.
distribute it among your students if you'd like.
So let me pull this piece together, and then I'll ask one more question and open it up for others to ask questions.
Sure.
And that is that what this process of psalm composition and preservation was about was engaging in an intimate connection with the source of creation and sharing that what God evoked, the prophecy being the engagement with God and the words that flow through the human being in that ecstatic state of connection with God. Is that sound right as a summary?
Yes, moderns don't do prophecy as an institution the justice it deserves when they dismiss it as mere prognostication. The prophets were not just, Merlins who told the future. It was of something very different than that. There was an element of being able to see the future, of course. That's why prophecy means what it means in English. But it wasn't exactly like that. It wasn't like using a crystal ball to peer into the magically know, who's going to win the World Series next year. That's not what it was. The idea is that you invite the God, the prophetic spirit, the Holy Spirit, whatever you call it, some aspect of some knowable aspect of our unknowable God, to engage with you in a level of intimacy that is psychic. In other words, you the God in heaven and you, flesh and blood, can't be pals. That doesn't make any sense. But God does have an aspect of God's self that can communicate with people. That's the Holy Spirit. And you have a psychic aspect of yourself that can engage with that. That's the soul. Sorry.
That's okay. And
Um,
so my closing question for segueing, they may one at the very end. Give an example of a favorite psalm and how you can draw from the psalm, how it informs. Give an example of how a psalm informs your own spirituality, your own connection to God.
well, I can think of lots of psalms that I would talk about, but I think that since today is Thursday, I'll speak about the 81st Psalm, which is the psalm for Thursdays, as you were sure this morning. Um, the 81st Psalm is in some ways a key psalm. It talks, because more than any of the other psalms, it talks openly, or except also obscurely, about rituals that we have never heard of. Right? We know, we modern Jewish people are well aware of the rituals of antiquity, including the ones that we don't do anymore, the ones that connected with the Beit HaMikdash, or the sacrificial service, or things like that. But in this psalm, there are references to rituals we've never heard about. I remove the burden from my back. I take my hands off of the pot. These are obscure phrases. And then at the end of the psalm, and there are many others as well. But then there is the most remarkable passage at the end of the psalm, which sort of sums up the whole thing. I don't know if you have your books in front of you, but I'm talking about Psalm 81, verses 11 and following, where the psalmist reimagines Sinai. You all know the story of Mount Sinai from, I assume. The Israelites come to the mountain, and Hashem speaks to them from atop the mountain and speaks the Ten Commandments. And the idea is that if you remember, the end of the story is the people can't quite take it. It's too overwhelming, this experience of God's presence, and they say, you know what? Why don't they say to Moses, why don't you go up and get the rest of these laws? But we'll just stay down here. And that is what happens. Moses goes up to the mountain, he returns. You all know the rest of the story. But the idea is that at the core of that story is the idea that the ultimate covenant experience is when God says, I am the Lord thy God that took thee out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. And then he says, and left unsaid is, these are the commandments you must follow to be faithful to me. Keep the Sabbath, honor your parents, don't kill, don't lie in court, don't covet your neighbor's spouses. And then presumably the part that God would have continued with if the people hadn't determined that they were unable to stand anymore, what we call Parshat Mishpatim, what the Bible calls Sefer HaBrit. Don't steal, don't be this way towards indentured servants, these are the laws relating to parents, to children, to employers, to employees, the stuff of daily life. So the idea is that God is saying, I'm the Lord thy God. These are the rules you have to follow if you want to be in my good graces. But now let's go back to the 81st Psalm, where the psalmist reimagines this. And in verse 8 starts the same way that we know in the Torah, in Parshat Yitro. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. But then he goes off in a different direction, saying, open wide your mouth and I will fill it up. In other words, I am the Lord your God, and if you want to serve me, open your mouth so that the words that will come out will not be your words, but my words. And then dejectedly, the poet imagines God saying, this is still saying, but my people didn't listen to my voice. They showed no desire for me. If my people would only listen to me, if Israel would walk in my ways, they would overwhelm their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. That notion that the psalmist is reimagining the Sinai, except that after God introduces himself as the Lord thy God that took you out of the land of Egypt, he says, if you want to serve me, you have to cultivate this, you have to open your mouth so that instead of your words coming out, my words come out, which is to say, I'm inviting you to be not a nation of priests, as the Torah of Moses says the Israelites are supposed to be, but a nation of prophets.
But what does that mean to you? How do you,
it's a look. I'm a rabbi. I sell the Torah of Moses, but so do you, and I do live my life that way. But I've also always understood that the point of obedience to the laws of the Torah is not just that you get special points for being obedient. It has to be there has to be spiritual improvement through the agency of Torah of the observance of the commandments. In other words, the point is not just to eat this pot of stew and not that pot, or to do this, to pick up your dry cleaning on Friday instead of on Saturday, or to eat chumetz all year and matzah this week as opposed to the other way around. The point of the mitzvot is not merely that they be done, but that they be springboards for spiritual growth. That you grow through the agency of your observance to become a finer, more spiritually adept person as you become older and presumably better at this and wiser at it. But my own synthesis of the Psalms and the Torah is that part of that is feeling God's presence in a way that is not merely sensory, but actually communicative, so that you feel that there is a certain intimacy between yourself and God that is personal and unique and idiosyncratic and unrelated to the relationship that someone else has. The same way that those of us who are lucky enough to be happily married feel about our marriages. My marriage is similar to other people's marriages. We're a man and a woman. We live in a house. We have children. That's not that unlikely. But there's also, in my heart, a sense that there's something deeply private and completely unique about this, my personal marriage. Perhaps you feel the same way about your relationships. There's a certain outer similarity, but the inner core is completely you. It's completely related to your personal ability to relate to the other person in that relationship. You're familiar about it, but there's also something deeply personal about it. I don't know if that's Ellie, is that a silly thing to say about to compare this to marriage? It seems to me that that's the most likely way that moderns will understand this, that there's something formal about it, that, I observe the same laws of kosher that you do, but there's also something that is deeply personal and about my observance that is not at all like your observance.
So
does that make sense?
What I hear you sharing is that Psalms are about an intimate relationship with God, and that Jewish life is a way to live that relationship. But ultimately, what the Psalms identifies for each of us is that there's an inner life dimension of relationship with God that comes out of being a religious person.
Yes, that's exactly right, and that makes we go there all the time. We just don't follow through on the thought. When how many days of your life have you said the words "V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha"? You shall love the Lord your God. But most of us, maybe even all of us, the only thing we know of love is the love that we feel for other people. I mean, so when it says you shall love the Lord your God, what exactly does that mean? There's no you there's no, you can't, God is not visible exactly, and there's no sensory sense of God's presence. So what does it mean to love the Lord your God? I think it means that the Torah, in that sense, is suggesting that there's supposed to be something of human love relationships in your relationship with God, and that there are similarities. You know, we can speak about ourselves, Ellie. Your and my marriages are similar. We have wives. We have 2 sons and a daughter. We live in houses. We are rabbis. Our lives are not that different, but of course they're also completely different.
Yeah, and so that's
There's
the
no
nature.
commonality between the inner me and the inner you. There's just these outer trappings that, by coincidence, are similar.
So with that as a bridge, does anybody have a question for Rabbi Cohen, for Martin, who's dedicated himself to Psalms? Cantor Shula, go ahead. Unmute, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. I was wondering about something you said in the very beginning, which is something I assumed also. And that is that only some of the Psalms were sung. And a whole bunch of them clearly were not. The "Oh my God, help me because it's terrible" kind of Psalms more than likely were not sung. And I was curious what you think or have found evidence of, or whatever, that happened with those other Psalms, if they were still somehow publicly presented. After all, this was pre-printing press, so I don't know that they could distribute it to people to take home by large numbers. So I'm curious what the non-sung Psalms you think might have been done with, and eventually they found themselves all into our book, but how do you think they were presented?
So the answer is, I think I have an answer to that, although I have to preface my answer by saying there's no real way to know the answer to the question.
Right.
For the rest of you, what Shula is saying is that a lot of the Psalms are clearly meant to be sung. It's, in fact, a lot of them say sing to the tune of, and we just don't know what that tune is anymore, but presumably this was "My Country 'Tis of Thee," the type of, the type of tune that everyone would know. And you're suggesting that the other ones were not meant to be sung. But my sense is that the whole book has a certain musicality for it. If you opened up the Siddur that we use in our synagogue, there will be no indication that any of it is sung. There are no melodies. There's no music written out. If you looked at Shacharit for Saturday morning in our Siddur, I'm not sure how you would know that El Adon is sung, but the paragraph that follows is not sung. And the truth is, it's not exactly not sung either. It's just chanted. There's a certain basic chant to the basic nusach that we use for basic chanting on Shabbat or on the holidays or on Yom Kippur. If you're, talented Balat Tfilah, then obviously you know these. If you're just a regular Jew in the pew, you sort of recognize them maybe without being able to dredge them up. But I think that all the Psalms were chanted. I think the ones that had real melodic content were labeled as such by the anthologizer at a certain point, and the other ones maybe were just sung to a certain trope or a certain mode that was not really a melody, but a certain musical mode that was known as the as the standard chanting mode. The same way that the Siddur and Shul doesn't tell you which is which, but everyone who goes to Shul sort of knows that. The fund of knowledge thing is profound when you study scripture. I'll return to that just for a second. We all do this automatically. Everyone does it. The newspaper, if you're writing in a newspaper and you mention Paris, in the LA Times, the guy is not going to say Paris, the capital of France. He assumes that everyone knows where Paris is. But there are plenty of cities in the world that you wouldn't do that with. You wouldn't, if you mentioned the capital of Kyrgyzstan, you would probably explain where that is because the average reader wouldn't know. So we have the same thing in Scripture. This is an ancient book. the anthologizer who created the Psalms clearly expects you to know lots of stuff. When he says play this on the Gittit, he thinks you know what a Gittit is. When he says play this on the Shminit, or play this on the Ugav, or play this on the on any of these instruments, he expects you that when he talks about Shamat symbols and Truah symbols, he thinks you know what the difference is, because I don't know, everyone knows the difference. The same way today in our world, everyone knows what a snare drum is or a bass drum is. But we've lost that. We don't have that anymore. We don't, that, and you can't pin that on the anthologizer. He had he presumed a fund of knowledge that simply is that we haven't maintained and that we don't know, and especially about music. So I think the answer to your question is that my sense is that all the Psalms were chanted. That's why they all went together. That's why the book is called, that we call them all Mizmorim, because the root Zayin Mem Resh implied chanting, and then some of them had special melodies, just like in our davening. Some of the passages have special melodies, and other passages don't.
So as a musician, it comes back to say this indeed is a musical collection. Take one more question or two, and then I have a closing question. We'll pull it together. An additional question?
If no one has any questions, I have a question for all of you.
Wait, I see. Is that Jack? Is that Rabbi Reamer has a question?
I don't see the screen. Oh, yes.
Yeah. You have to unmute. Oh, you don't have a question?
If you have.
Okay.
No.
All right.
I have a question.
Okay, go on, Viviana.
Martin, when you talk about them being prophets and the fact that at some point there was decided that we don't have prophets anymore, if we accept that they were prophets, then we could still have prophets today. That goes back to my question always, why do we think that the guy, thumping somewhere with something saying, God told me, we think he's a nut?
Yes, well, the answer is that the answer is that when people appear to know precisely what these oracles mean and want to get you to believe that, they're mostly just making it up, because the nature of prophetic speech, the nature of all oracular speech, is that it's deeply idiosyncratic. It has no ultimate meaning that is available to anybody. The prophetic experience was, the prophets were not loudspeakers that God just sort of spoke through, right? The prophetic experience in ancient times was completely different than that. It wasn't that you just sort of opened your mouth like in a horror movie, and instead of your voice coming out, the voice of God came out. I don't think that's what it was at all. To my way of thinking, this was the result of attaining a deep communion experience with the divine, with God. And if you were a regular person, you experienced it solely on the sensory plane. But if you were gifted, if you were a poet or a musician or somebody who was gifted with special eloquence and special articulacy, you could funnel that experience, you could channel that experience through the medium of language, and you could give voice to what the experience was like and speak in the name of God legitimately through this experience of God's presence. But this is all deeply subjective. To discuss whether someone is right or not, the question doesn't mean anything. It's like looking at a talented artist's painting of a lake and saying, is it right? I don't know what the question means. It means, does it look exactly like the lake? Other than that, would you say that all the Impressionists were wrong because their work didn't exactly look like what they were painting? That's the part of that was invested with their own artistry. That's what makes it personal and meaningful.
So
and I think this is in that sense.
Where it's personal and idiosyncratic, what should we gain from reading Psalms? Why should we, who are not prophets, read these prophetic works?
First of all, speak for yourself. Second of all,
well, that was going to be my last question. I'll tell you, I'll foreshadow, and that is, have you ever tried writing a psalm yourself?
So I'll answer the first question first and the second question second. We Jews today are in a remarkable situation, if we allow ourselves to see it that way. in that spiritual energy, I believe, is generated the same way that all energy in the physical world is generated, through tension and through stress. And the tension in my life, I'm speaking personally now, not on behalf of anyone else. The tension, the Jewish tension that pushes me forward is the tension between obedience to the commandments, and in my own case, I try to be strictly obedient to the commandments, and this need for the entire experience to be fully idiosyncratic and personal as well. It's not the idea that you can seek God's presence in the world through the medium of obedience, but at the same time that you want this to be, you want to know God not only as this divine lawgiver, but as the Yedid Nefesh, as well as the soul of intimacy at the same time, and that those ideas don't really work well together. In fact, sometimes in your life they're antithetical, and to allow the tension between those two impetuses to generate the type of energy that can motivate you as a Jewish person to spend your life in the service of God. That's I think what's best to be learned from studying the Psalms. And to answer your next question, the other, which you already gave away, is the question is if I've ever done this myself.
Yeah.
I
write a psalm.
The only psalms that I've ever written are wordless, are music. When I compose music, that music is I never compose songs. I don't compose that kind of music, only instrumental music. And through that type of music, I sense I sense myself somehow stepping into this world. We've one of the tragedies of Jewish life is the degree to which we've lost our music. We have no obviously there are no recordings from ancient times, but we have no. The Jews didn't figure out how to note down musical notation, how to preserve their melodies, how to preserve their tropes, how to preserve their nigunim. It just all fell away. We know they had it because they reference it, but you can only see the literary references. You can't hear it.
So what I'm going to now move towards summing up as we're moving toward the completion of an hour. And that is what I've gained from our conversation, having spent all this time reading your deeply detailed understanding of the words. When you describe the Psalms in your book, which you do, all 150 Psalms, there's clearly a sense that you've spent a lot of time with each of the Psalms and that the words have distinctive resonance and are well chosen. And yet, what I've gained from this conversation beyond that is that underneath the words is a relationship, and that what Psalms are not just songs of the Second Temple, not at all. They are prophecies, and prophecies are communications with the divine, of being engaged in relationship with the divine, and that the Psalms are our people's collection of those kinds of witnessing. And by we reading Psalms, knowing they often had music to accompany them, we are invited and engaged with relationship with the divine. And to say what that is hard to say because it's idiosyncratic for the psalmist, and more, it's idiosyncratic in all our lives. And that for you, that sense of flow, of transcending yourself, is more identified with the experience of writing music, and that the Psalms take it even beyond to having words. So that's my summary of what I've heard from you. Martin, you have the final word to react.
I leave you only with one verse from the Psalms, which the one I referred to before. Anochi Hashem Elokecha hamalcha me'eretz Mitzrayim harcheticha v'amalehu. I am the Lord your God, who brought you forth from the land of Egypt. Open up your mouth, and I'll fill it up. And that notion that the ultimate communion experience involves not just God speaking, but you speaking, and you speaking the word of God through the achievement of this ultimate this ultimately intimate experience, To me, that's the essence of Jewishness. And that's why I love working on the Psalms. There's also a California connection, Ellie, by the way. The section on the Shirei Hamalot, the songs of the steps, that portion was written at Camp Ramon, California.
By whom?
By me.
Oh,
I mean, my commentary on the Shirei Hamalot was written
in your book at Camp Ramon.
At Camp Ramon, California.
Yeah, so that's only to say it's been a multi-year journey for
Many
you
years.
through Psalms. So I want to thank you, my friend, for making this time with us, some who had time with you in Orange County, all of you who've now been here. I much recommend Rabbi Cohen's book on Psalms, as beautiful in its translations, engaging, and with the commentary challenging us how to personalize the message of the psalmist. We look forward to your novel of the Levite in the Second Temple, which will elucidate the writing and singing of psalms as well. My friend, Rabbi Cohen, thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. It's been my pleasure to visit with you. And I hope that you all spend many, many hours enjoying the Psalms. If my book assists you in that, it's my great pleasure to think that it would. And I look forward to meeting with you again sometime, perhaps.
Thank you.